And welcome into our second awards show episode. The fantasy football season is over, and we are handing out our awards. We just recorded fantasy football MVP, best draft day value, and fantasy rookie of the year. So go check that one out if you haven't already. This one, we're going to be talking about biggest bust. We got breakout, and we have players that we're definitely targeting next year, some guys that have improved their value. I'm joined by Will from Media today. How are we doing?
We're doing good, Zach. How about you?
We got your team probably deserves some awards this season as the Vikings. You know, they could fall under best draft day value if you were talking about a team you really didn't, or maybe even breakout of the year if you're talking about a team you really didn't expect. The Vikings came to play, so that's a team that definitely should have some superlatives coming their way. Probably won't because this is the NFL and the Vikings don't have the big names that they got in the other teams, but for us, we may give some Vikings some awards.
We may get a little bit.
So we can stay tuned for that. We're going to start off with the big one. Biggest bust. A guy you drafted on draft day, you were super excited for, you drafted him high, and all of a sudden he's costing your team's weeks. I tried to stay with players that were healthy for most of the season, as did Will. Guys who were able to play that you were putting in your lineups. We didn't pick Christian McCaffrey, although he would be the biggest bust because he only played a couple games. But we wanted guys who actually were out there on the field and still sucked. So I'm going to start with Deebo Samuel, 28-year-old Deebo Samuel, who was drafted at the beginning of the season as the wide receiver 13, and he did not quite live up to that, finishing as the wide receiver 44. He had a couple good weeks looking at his finishes. He had 3 wide receiver 1 finishes. He had 1 wide receiver 2 finish on a week. And then he had finishes of 77, 62, 71, 94, 70, 55, 45. He was playing in all games, but 2 realistically, and it really hurt your team for the most part if you didn't have him, or if you did have him out there. He just was not as involved. And even after Brandon Ayuk went down with an injury, you would have thought, oh my gosh, Deebo Samuel, this guy's going to go off now. He's their main target. Christian McCaffrey's not there. Jordan Mason's not there. This has to be Deebo Samuel time. Turns out it was Juwan Jennings and George Kittle, who were coming out and absorbing those targets. Ricky Pearsall even got more targets coming near the end of the season. Outside of his one game, he had a good game against Miami, but it was really just a rough stretch for Deebo Samuel. So he has to be my bust of the year. Will, who is your bust of the year?
So I feel bad saying this because I actually think he's a great running back and has potential. And he's just in a bad situation, but it's Travis Etienne. Because, going into the start of the season, right? Top 20 pick, running back 7, almost top 15 pick, right?
Yep.
And then you look at running backs that were taken after him: Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry, James Cook, even Joe Mixon to a sense, Kenneth Walker. There's some, I know Walker injury, but I'm just saying, I think the expectations were so high for him that he's a bust to me. Not anything to say he did, but just because the team way underperformed than I think that everybody thought was going to happen in Jacksonville. I mean, I think Tank Bigsby actually had more fantasy points than Etienne at the end of the year. Mm-hmm. So, for those of us that were high, I didn't draft him. I don't own any share of them, but I have a lot of people that were like, hey, this is the year. It's going to be out. It's going to run, get those points. I think he hurt a lot of owners who had a lot of hope in him.
Yeah, Tank Bigsby looked a little more explosive at times, and the team just kind of started to fade away from Travis Etienne after his injury. They were starting Mac Jones near the end of the season. Evan Ingram had his share of injuries. The Jaguars themselves, for the most part, just didn't live up to their expectations. Not saying all of the Jaguars. We may talk about a player later from the Jaguars who definitely lived up to his expectations, even maybe exceeded them. But for the most part, Travis Etienne was definitely a letdown, didn't perform to his draft position. And I've seen him on a lot of lists. People were like, Travis Etienne, definitely the biggest bust of 2024. Next, more of a positive note, breakout players, some guys who you kind of maybe saw the breakout coming. Some people may not have. Some people may have been out on these players because of what had happened. But I'm going to start. I was between 2 players. I love Jameson Williams, and he finally did have his breakout. But I think this other wide receiver, who I also really liked and thought I traded for him at the beginning of this season in Dynasty, I traded away Jaden Reed and a second and got back this player in a first, and that's Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Looking back, I am extremely happy to have Jaxon Smith-Njigba and a first-round pick as opposed to Jaden Reed in a second. So I'm really happy with what I've seen from Jaxon Smith. People were really out on him based on his rookie metrics. But you have to come back. When you're looking at Jaxon Smith-Njigba, we're talking about a guy who, when you're looking at what he did in college, it wasn't just like, okay, he was good. He was the best wide receiver in college. Even Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, who were on his team, acknowledged that Jaxon Smith-Njigba, even though he was younger, was still probably the best wide receiver on that team. He really showed out this year, 100 receptions, 1,100 yards, and he really kind of took over that wide receiver 2 spot, maybe even became the wide receiver 1 for Seattle. If DK Metcalf is still there next year, maybe not great for his consistency, as he was kind of inconsistent, but he did have his stretch where he had 13 targets, 11 targets, 7 targets, 4, 5, 12, and 12. So he's really earning those targets. He gets open, and he's explosive with the ball in his hand. So for me, Jaxon Smith-Njigba, he proved all of the people who were like, oh my God, this guy had a terrible rookie season. I have to get rid of him. He proved them wrong. He came out, broke out, and I could see a situation where he is the wide receiver 1 on this team going into next year. If they decide to move on from DK Metcalf and trade him, which I can see as possible, it could be Jaxon Smith-Njigba. And maybe they bring back Tyler Lockett, the shell of Tyler Lockett as a locker room guy if they do get rid of DK. But I think JSN has really shown us this year that he's here to stay, and he's going to be a top wide receiver in this league for a while.
Agree.
Who's your breakout? Not a guy who maybe had a bad rookie season. Maybe he was just struggling in general.
I'm going to show some love in fantasy football to Sam Darnold. Because, look, he was quarterback 31, average draft position 31 for quarterback, but 210. And he's a top 9, top 10, maybe top 5, 7, depending on your league scores, fantasy quarterback this year. And part of the reason I want to give that to him is I think it shows in fantasy sometimes, especially in keepers, if you keep a guy, especially a young quarterback, give him a chance because you never know when that breakthrough might happen. Also, I think it shows the epitome of the NFL that there is no way I'm ever drafting a Jets quarterback ever with this current ownership, ever. You just can't, like some franchises, and you're starting to get that sense with the Bears with Caleb Williams, that maybe it's just in their DNA. They can't develop quarterbacks. We'll see who they hire as a coach. But back to Sam, I think Sam deserves it because there's no way anyone believed that Sam Darnold was a top 10 fantasy quarterback going into this season. And it was a breakout year for him, especially after the years he had prior. This is if you're going to give me a breakout player, you have to consider Sam Darnold in that list as a fantasy breakout quarterback.
Yeah, if you had him on your bench in Dynasty, you couldn't be happier with his season. To me, it shows that quarterbacks are often moved on from too quickly. And as you said, it's not the quarterback sometimes, it's the system or the team around them, because you put him into where Kirk Cousins was, and he performed better than Kirk Cousins, at the same level than Kirk Cousins. And you take Kirk Cousins, put him in Atlanta, and he had a terrible season. So if you really look at it that way, it does come down to who's around the players. Even just looking at C.J. Stroud, his offensive line in his rookie year was great, and you take away his offensive line this year, and it's shaky. So you really have to put these quarterbacks in good situations if you want them to succeed.
And look at Bryce Young, right? Halfway through the season, everybody's like, oh, my God, he's a bust. And look at him. He is a different player the last 3 or 4 weeks. That is the first-round pick that everybody thought he was going to be. His last 2 weeks, watching his mannerism, I am excited to see him next year and what he brings to the field, because I think he is going to put up numbers that everybody's going to have to eat a lot of crow.
Absolutely. Bryce Young, since his return after being benched, I believe PFF has him rated as a top 5 quarterback for the rest of the season. He probably orchestrated about 8 or 9 game-winning drives. Unfortunately, the Panthers had the worst defense in the league, so we allowed the most points that have ever happened, but Bryce Young looked like the guy. We ended up winning, I think, 3 of those games. which was in overtime, Bryce Young going down the field scoring, Bryce Young against Kansas City going down the field. We didn't win the game because the defense gave up, but he went down the field. He scored.
Yeah.
He really showed that he's going to take this offense to the next level. That's what happens when quarterbacks are comfortable in the pocket. And you don't even have to have the best weapons. Adam Thielen was his number one target. And, Adam Thielen is not an elite wide receiver one, but he's just there. He makes the plays. The quarterback's comfortable with him. And when he can trust his offensive line, which is what I think people are talking about, the downfall of C.J. Stroud this year. To me, he just isn't comfortable behind that offensive line. And that really just affects young people's minds if they're not set. They're not comfortable. You need to make sure that they have that offensive line, which Caleb Williams right now doesn't. So we'll see. Maybe they'll still learn from what the Panthers did with Bryce Young and give him some help. We can hope. But for now, I think, like you said, we're going to stick with the Panthers here for a player that I think you must target next year, and that's Chuba Hubbard. Jonathan Brooks tore his ACL again late in the season, so he's probably, if he returns, it's maybe end of year. Miles Sanders is on the fringe of being cut contract-wise. He may not be with the team next year, and you're looking at Chuba Hubbard, who finished the year as the running back 14, and he missed the last 2 weeks due to an injury. He also was not the running back one to start the season because it was with Miles Sanders that he was splitting. But you look at his stretch where he had 20 points, 21 points, 14 points, 18 points. Like, he was having RB1 numbers week in, week out. And I think, as Will and I both expect, this team is going to take a step forward next year. Hopefully the defense can allow some
NFC South champs. I'm going to claim it right now.
I agree. If we can put some players on defense where we're in more favorable rushing downs as well, Canales will keep running the ball behind our offensive line. And I think Bryce continues to take a step forward. So for me, I really want a piece of this offense next year. And I don't know who the wide receivers are going to be. So if you can give me the consistent
Xavier Leggett. Come on, I own Xavier Leggett in league. Like, I'm sitting on him now. That's gonna pay off.
I don't know. We've seen Garrett Wilson on Twitter came out. He hasn't posted since beginning of the season. He's like, yeah, Bryce is better than people think he is. That's his only tweet since then. He maybe wants out of New York. Give me Garrett Wilson, Bryce Young, Chuba Hubbard, and Adam Thielen in this offense. Yes, please.
No, don't kill my Xavier Leggett stock. Don't do that.
I want to see him. He's got that wrist injury. I want to see if that's the reason for his drops. Yeah. If those aren't, he's got to work on his hands this offseason, and he's got to stay healthy because he's been hurt way too many times. Jalen Coker looked like the better wide receiver this year.
You chose violence, Zach. You didn't have to choose violence here. You could just all boats rise, brother. All boats.
I hope it works. I hope it works out. I would rather see the team bring in a wide receiver one for Bryce, whether it's T. Higgins, Garrett Wilson, Tet in the draft.
T. Higgins would be.
Yeah, I want to see them bring in a wide receiver one, and Leggett can be the wide receiver two on the team, and Thielen can play in the slot where he belongs.
Yeah.
That would be ideal for me. Will, who is your player you must have next year, who's maybe was on a disappointing team this year?
Oh, Brian Thomas. Yeah. I think if you can get him, especially in Dynasty, the kid just looks like a wide receiver one.
He was
soon to be top 5, I think, in the next couple of years. I think Jacksonville gets it together. And he was doing well with Jacksonville being a dumpster fire. If they
he was wide receiver 4 on the season. Wide receiver 4 was his finish.
Yeah.
Which is crazy.
With Matt Jones.
Yeah. Yeah, he was putting up good numbers with Jones. He was putting up good numbers. And it really took him, he wasn't like he's the wide receiver one at the first part of the season, but it really took off after their bye week. Where he was on the field for like 80s, 90% of the time, wide receiver 13, 23, 4, 3, 13. That's what you want. You want to see that improvement, kind of that Justin Jefferson-esque progression from the same school and everything. So if they can get it figured out next year, a healthy Trevor Lawrence, a new coach, it could be dangerous for Brian Thomas, who already finished as a wide receiver 4. So why wouldn't you want to have him? And I don't think you're going to be paying wide receiver 4 value for him next year in drafts. So definitely, I agree. There are 3 awards just been handed out. As I said before, we recorded a previous episode, MVP, Best Draft Day Value, Fantasy Rookie of the Year. So go check those out if you haven't already. Thanks, Will, for joining me.
Thanks.
We'll see you again next week.
All right. Skol.